changed over the decades, and I've actually got a chance to tell quite a few stories up here. But this is a story that I have always wanted to tell. This is a folk tale, and being a folk teller, the opportunity to tell some good folk tales is very important to me. And folk tales are actually written by the culture in which they're told. So I had an idea for a story, and maybe I'll tell you that backstory another time. Right now they want me to get this done in like 15 minutes, so. Well, what I ended up with was bringing a story around to a bunch of people, and they helped me develop it into a larger story, into a story that belongs to people like us. So if I'd love you to lend me your ears while I share the tale of a sorcerer who wanted to live forever. Now in those days, in that place, he put all of his wealth, all of his efforts into finding that secret for immortality. He traveled to the four corners of the earth and finally found it was a complex formula, a secret ritual that, when combined, created an elixir of eternal life. There was only one problem. The primary ingredient of this elixir was the blood of a 21-year-old virgin. Now in those days, in that place, women were free and they did what they wanted, and most of them had explored life and love long before 21, so it didn't matter how much he offered, what he offered. There just were no virgins of that age to be found. So he put his mind to other ways of getting women to do what he wanted. He had some success with puppies. Yes, hybriding them with common household herbs until he came up with this rosemary bush, very potent rosemary bush. And since rosemary's both medicinal and culinary, he had no problem getting it into local shops. A couple of doses of that rosemary zest and you'd be hooked. You'd be back for more. And so his wealth and his influence increased. And one of those people was a young woman, a singer of songs, and she'd been exploring life and love enough to create a life to love. And in her pregnancy, she was experiencing some very, very strong cravings. And not knowing about the manifestations of the sorcerer, she added a little zest into her meal, and soon she had a habit she could not afford on her singer's salary. And so she finds herself one night sitting up in her apartment, going through the agonies of withdrawal, when she smells the scent of that herb she so desires, and looking out the window down in her neighbor's garden, she sees that rosemary bush glowing silvery blue in the moonlight. And even though she'd heard from her friends that the guy next door was some kind of sexual pervert, she goes on down into the garden, she breaks off a sprig. But there is no sneaking into a sorcerer's garden. He steps out of the shadows before she can reach the gate, and he is angry. You dare steal from me! She's so afraid she falls down on her knees. Please, sir, please. I'm pregnant, I couldn't help myself. Pregnant? And suddenly his anger dissipates as he realizes this is his opportunity. He says, "Oh, I understand. Take all the rosemary you want. But promise me your child. If it's a girl, when she's of an appropriate age, apprentice her to me. And I will protect her reputation, keep her safe. And when she's 21, she'll have a trade." And the woman, thinking she was fortunate, promised her unborn child to the sorcerer, and left with a large basket of rosemary zest. Well, the child was born. It was a girl, and they named her Rosemary after her mother's hook. But little Rosemary sang. At first, she cooed the croonings her mother sang in her cradle. And then she began mimicking her mom backstage as her mom performed. Then she sang a song, any song she heard, anybody singing it, pull it out of the ear, first hearing like magic. After that, she began weaving together words and notes in ways that created melodies that mesmerized the listener. And then she turned 7, started school. And as she walked home from school each day, she would have to walk past the sorcerer's house, and he would call out, "Rosemary, remind your mother of her promise." So little Rosemary, she'd go into her mom's and say, "Hey, Mommy, the man next door says remember your promise." Her mother would just say, "Ignore him." And that just meant that every day when Rosemary sang her way home from school, she'd have to walk past that sorcerer's house, and he would call out, "Rosemary, remind your mother of her promise." And she would remind her mom, and her mom would say, "Just ignore him." Until one day, she didn't. It might have been the drugs. She could have just been hangry. I don't know. But that day, she was beside herself, and she said to the little girl, "Just tell him, take it." And so the next day, as Rosemary sang her way home from school, and she walked past the sorcerer's house, and he called out, "Rosemary," she said. "She says, just take it." So he reached out the window, he grabbed this little girl, pulled her in, locked her up in the garret, and he never let her out. But Rosemary sang. She sang every song she'd ever sung and made new songs to sing. And the sorcerer began to notice that out in front of the house, out in the street, all the people from the neighborhood, they gathered in front of his house listening to Rosemary sing. And he didn't care because he liked it too, until she turned 14. But then he noticed that most of the people standing around listening to Rosemary sing were young men, and that made him nervous because he still had 7 more years and he really wanted to live forever. So he conjured a tower far out in the wilderness where nobody ever went. It was 70 feet tall, window way up at the top, only way in or out. He puts Rosemary up into that tower, and then he spells her hair and conjures it, grows long and thick and strong, and they weave it into a rope. And Rosemary, she sits in a chair by the window and hooks the top of the braid to a hook, tosses the rest out, whatever the sorcerer calls. "Rosemary, Rosemary, let down your sweet hair." He climbs up, spends the day at his sorcerer's workbench, creating potions and spells and listening to Rosemary sing, and he has her all to himself. But as Rosemary grows into her maidenhood, the sorcerer begins to have a new problem. His masculine desires begin to conflict with his long-term goals, and he realizes he can't spend that much time alone in the tower with Rosemary. So he takes to coming once a day, rather early on, comes to the window, calls out, climbs up, gives her the things she needs, he climbs back down, and he's gone for another day. And that, of course, is when the hunter showed up. Yes, a young man out in the wilderness looking for some great beast to prove his manhood. He hears the singing in the wind. And he follows it, arrives in sight of the tower just as the sorcerer shows up, listens to him call out, "Rosemary, Rosemary, let down your sweet hair," watches him climb up a few moments later, climb down, and he's gone. And the hunter thinks, "I'd like to try that." So he goes over to the tower and he calls out, "Rosemary, Rosemary, let down your sweet hair." And Rosemary, thinking that it's just the sorcerer, must have forgotten something, drops down the braid. He scrambles up, and wasn't she surprised to see a young man in her window? Oh, she's afraid. He reassures her, "Don't be scared. I heard you singing. It was so beautiful. almost as beautiful as you. Yeah, flattery will get you far if you're a young man in a young woman's window. She let him stay. And when he left, she didn't think she needed to tell the sorcerer about that. So he came back. And they became friends. Well, maybe more than friends, because they were talking about creating a new life for themselves, someplace far away from towers and sorcerers. And the hunter said, Rosemary, how will you get out of the tower? She said, that's the easy part. And she cut off the braid, tied it to the hook at the top of the window. She said one minute she went over to the sorcerer's workbench and she took out 3 small nuts, about the size of an acorn. And on each of these nuts, there was carved the face of an animal. The first one had the face of a dog, the second was a lion, and the third was the face of a wolf. And she put those nuts into a pouch on her belt, and she climbed down the braid and rode away. But there's no sneaking out of a sorcerer's tower. He actually knew the moment she cut off the braid. He came as quick as he could, but by that time, that was all that was left. So he scrambled up the braid and he went over to his workbench and he took out his magic eye and his 7-league boots. And then walking over to the window, he looks out into the wilderness with his magic eye until he spots the lovers riding away, and he puts on his 7-league boots, and 7 leagues with every step, he's soon catching up. But Rosemary saw him coming, and she reached into the pouch on her belt and she pulled out that first nut, the nut with the face of the dog, and she tosses it over her shoulder, and when it hits the ground, poof, up springs a huge bull mastiff with huge jowls and sharp teeth and drool splattering in every direction, and he's threatening and growling, and the sorcerer has to stop and deal with that, and he conjures up a flock of birds which he sends flying at the dog, and as the dog is snapping at the birds, the sorcerer steps around, and with those 7-league boots he's catching up again. But Rosemary sees him coming, and she takes the second nut and she tosses that over her shoulder, and up springs a huge lion. But this time the sorcerer knows what's going on, and he conjures up a donkey and casts that donkey right into the jaws of the lion, ripping off its skin in the process. And as the lion is trying to deal with the carcass of the donkey, the sorcerer dons the donkey's skin and camouflage, disguise. He runs off to the side and up ahead to set an ambush for the young couple. But Rosemary sees him coming, and she pulls out that last nut, the nut with the face of the wolf. And just as the sorcerer is about to pounce, she throws that nut down at his feet. Up springs a huge wolf that snaps up the donkey's skin, sorcerer and all. So he doesn't get to live forever. But Rosemary sings happily ever after. The end. The story of Rosemary, an American folktale. Thank you all. That was awesome. You guys are really